Rivero had one of the very first alternative investigative news journal websites, whatreallyhappened.com, in the mid-1990s. He was instrumental, more than anybody else, including Christopher Ruddy, who also deserves a lot of the credit, for successfully exposing the fact that Vince Foster was murdered. He's broken a lot of other major investigations. And before he leaves us early in the next hour, I do want to get his analysis of this huge report, now picked up by Keith Olbermann after we pushed for it Thursday and Friday, you, the listeners, did, about Dick Cheney wanting to have fake Iranian boats made in U.S. shipyards attack U.S. naval craft. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, and there's 11 other terrorist attacks that Dick Cheney is planning. And Cy Hirsch just at a media conference just kind of, just jokingly talks about it and says, yeah, we wrote an article about how they were planning to stage something, but we didn't want to say what. That's a big issue right there. This isn't a joke or a game, ladies and gentlemen. There's over 200 declassified examples of criminal elements of our government. This is admitted where they did stage attacks. We're in a lot of danger here. It's bipartisan. Don't think when George Bush flies off into the sunset, all this ends. I'm not defending George Bush, but the guy runs nothing. And the evidence says he didn't even exactly know what was going on 9/11 from his activities. But I'll tell you who did. Dick Cheney, in control at the bunker, according to Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta, in control of the stand-down. We'll talk about all that later with Mike Rivera, who's also an expert on 9/11. Now, in my film Matrix of Evil, we cover who the main suspect in the Anthrax attacks are. He's a dual Mossad / U.S. government bioweapons expert. The papers on the East Coast and news stations, TV, did report that he broke into Fort Detrick, Maryland, after he'd been fired. He did break into the Level 4 bioweapons lab where the U.S.-grade weapons, super weaponized anthrax was stored. But he was never the suspect. First, it was Hatfield, who's now won a huge multi-million-dollar lawsuit, totally innocent. Just like when the feds bombed in the Olympic Park, they tried to blame Richard Jewell. Now they've set up Eric Rudolph. It's the same thing here. Remember, and they told you it was non-weaponized. Turned out when samples came out, it was the most weaponized, ever designed, patented U.S. Just the process of miniaturizing it takes over $100 million of equipment and a giant factory, and is so deadly that it is in containment units, and robotic arms are used to manufacture it in these giant cylinders. Remember, the FBI lied to us about that. They lied and said that it was Mr. Hatfield. Now, they have found a classic patsy who, even after they claim he'd been visiting his shrink, his government shrink, and saying he wanted to go into the lab and shoot everybody, and he was involved in the vaccines, not in the weapons side, and that's in the Washington Post today. Even the Washington Post says scientists question FBI probe on anthrax because they're the experts. They say he didn't have access to it. He couldn't get in there. Well, why are you? Well, no doubt, folks, he didn't commit suicide. That's a 99% chance. So they murder somebody. Out of thousands of scientists, they find one who's mentally ill, one they can have as psychiatrist say, yeah, he didn't talk about anthrax attacks. We talked about shooting people. But they didn't do anything. In fact, they continue to let him work in and around non-weaponized anthrax for the last few years. So that's some of the basic facts here. But we do know who the main suspect is, and we've known this for 5 years. I made Matrix of Evil 5 years ago and briefly covered it. Mike Rivero has done the original research and put it all together. And this is amazing info. We're going to have him with us into the next hour. And then I want to get into Dick Cheney wanting to attack U.S. ships. This is public. Cy Hirsch, most respected investigative journalist living. And now Keith Olbermann has covered it. Thank God, because I knew people would say when we talked about it or played the video clip of Cy Hirsch saying this that they wouldn't believe it. We can now push this further out in the light and demand Hirsch be drug in and tell us the other 11 targets. I demand to know those other 11 targets. But again, we're getting to that later. I rarely have two such huge stories. I don't know which one to get to first, but they all deal with government-sponsored terror. We haven't even gotten into how the White House was on Cipro, the anthrax-fighting antibiotic, September 10th, 4 weeks before it shows up. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, this is bombshell information. Let's go to Mike Rivero right now. Mike, I've set the table with some facts. Can you, in a chronological order, roll out what happened with the anthrax? People forgotten. It's been almost 7 years. Go through all of that and then bring us up to speed with this new patsy and then who the main suspect is.
Okay, well, basically, shortly after 9/11, at the time when President Bush was trying to get the USA Patriot Act ramrodded through Congress, these letters started showing up. They were filled with this weaponized anthrax. The letters themselves and envelopes were deliberately written to place the blame for these attacks on Arab Muslims. Very crude writing, very poor spelling, references to Allah, death to Israel, and all the rest of it. So it was very obviously an attempt to point the finger of blame for the anthrax letters on some Arab Muslims.
And this is the same government, I've got to add this, because we can't forget this, that planted 2 fake passports on the scene of the towers in 9/11 and then later admitted they were fake but wouldn't say where they came from. The same government that planted the bags of the hijackers everywhere, only their bags didn't go through security. But go ahead.
Yeah, basically, it was a very obvious setup. And, because of the fear of the anthrax letters, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act without even looking at it. And it was a big, big, scary deal. Now, fortunately, not that many people were killed. It was a relatively minor incident, but, of course, the media played it up. We were all in danger. People were afraid of opening their envelopes, and it was a very scary time. Now, as we all know, it became apparent very quickly that this anthrax, in fact, had come from within the United States. There were foreign labs who had requested samples of it, and they quickly identified the genetic structure as identical to a strain kept at Fort Detrick. So it became more and more obvious that this was beyond the capacity of al-Qaeda to produce, and they started to look for somebody inside the U.S. government. Now, according to the Hartford Courant and other sources who are quoting from apparently now classified U.S. government documents, there was a scientist working at Fort Detrick by the name of Dr. Philip Zach, and he was caught on the security system going into the lab where the anthrax used in the letters was kept, and he did this after did not have authorization to be there, because he'd been fired over a racially motivated attack against an Egyptian co-worker.
Now, let's be clear. We got somebody breaking, a bioweapons scientist, breaking into a level 4 lab, international incident right there alone. It's covered up.
And basically a lot of people are convinced that it was this same Dr. Philip Zach who sent letters to the FBI attempting to frame the Egyptian scientist for the anthrax letters as well. And they investigated him briefly and let him go. Then all of a sudden, Zach, he's moved out to, I believe he's currently at Dugway Proving Grounds. He still has his security clearance. He still has his job. He's still working on these things that kill a lot of people. Meanwhile, apparently at the urging of Dr. Barbara Rosenberg, the FBI focuses on Dr. Stephen Hatfield, and they proceed to destroy his life bit by bit. They point him out to the media. They call him a person of interest, which is a null term with no legal validity. And the media hounds him, and they turn his life into a fishbowl. He can't get work. He is losing everything he's ever worked for. I'm glad he sued. I'm glad he won. I'm glad he got his settlement. Then the FBI, which of course is having to deal with this question of why can't you guys find out who did this? Apparently they focused on some other scientists except for Dr. Zach, the man caught going into the lab where the anthrax was kept. And this Bruce Ivins was apparently being harassed and hounded much the same way that Stephen Hatfield was. It was not allowed into the press to forestall a potential lawsuit, but from his associates, it is clear that the FBI simply harassed this man to death.
Now, that's the patsy. Stay there. We're going to come back and analyze the patsy, analyze the real suspect here. Ladies and gentlemen, you're getting information the establishment does not want you to have. Okay? They launched those attacks to create more fear. They launched it against Democrats. They launched it against American media that had done hit pieces on the Bushes. And the White House was on Cipro. Multiple smoking guns in triplicate. We'll cover it all on the other side with Mike Rivero of WhatReallyHappened.com. My website's PrisonPlanet.com.